Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. Let's wait for all participants to join us. Let's give them just a minute and we'll start. Okay, thank you, everyone. Let's start the webinar and others will join us in the process. So thank you very much for joining us in this webinar entitled Protecting Persons Displaced in the Context of Climate Change and Disasters in Africa. Please let us know in the chat box where you're from and your job titles or the organizations for which you work. Thank you very much for that. My name is Abi Yashanafi, and I'm the acting manager of the Migration Unit at the Center for Human Rights. And I'm also a doctoral candidate at the center. This webinar is organized by the Center for Human Rights and Unhcr Regional Bureau for Southern Africa. And the aim of this webinar is to engage various stakeholders, including civil society organizations, academics, and others in advocacy for the prevention of climate change, for the prevention of displacement in the context of climate change and disasters, as well as for the protection of persons displaced in this context. And we are very pleased to have a great group of panelists and renowned scholars, as well as practitioners who will be speaking in this webinar, including Dr. Patrick Ebba from the Unhcr, Mr. Lloyd Kouveia from the Center for Human Rights, Ms. Isabel Michel from the Unhcr, Ursula from the Unhcr Regional Bureau for Southern Africa, Cristiano Dorsey, Dr. Cristiano Dorsey from the University of Johannesburg, Mr. Arnold from IOM Regional Office for Southern Africa, as well as Dr. Carissa Faole from University of Johannesburg, and Kaliste Kavuro from Stellenbosch University. Thank you all so much for joining us. As I said, the aim of this webinar is, to engage everyone in discussion and also to understand the various debates around the legal protection of displaced persons in the context of climate change and disasters. So you can raise questions and comments throughout this webinar, but you should do this in the chat box while panelists are speaking. Otherwise, please mute your microphones whenever you're not speaking. So you will have the opportunity to speak, to ask questions and to raise comments after all panelists have spoken or made presentations. So without further ado, I will give the floor to Mr. Lloyd Kuveya, who is the Assistant Director of the Center for Human Rights, for his welcoming remarks to this webinar. Thank you so much, Mr. Lloyd. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Abi. And I would like to start by, first of all, greeting everybody who has joined us in the webinar. A very good morning to you, good afternoon or evening, depending on where you are at this particular juncture. Currently, I am speaking from Egypt, where the center, together with the British University in Egypt, are jointly organizing or actually running the Christoph Haynes African Human Rights Moot Court competition. So we are here in Egypt. We are actually now going into the final rounds, which are happening tomorrow, where we are going to be finalizing the proceedings. And I was just sharing that, it's interesting that we are holding this very important webinar in the context of the effects of global warming that we are actually, some of us are experiencing, because the temperatures currently in North Africa are so high. We are struggling actually to cope in the sweltering heat. And I think a lot of you will have also noted the very high temperatures that quite a number of European countries are experiencing, because we were actually, last week we were in Geneva, where we held and convened the Nelson Mandela World Human Rights Moot Court competition. And I can assure you that the temperatures in Geneva were really not comfortable at all. The temperatures were so high. There were colleagues who were calling us from the UK. We saw people who were struggling in Portugal and Spain. Many people were actually displaced because of the heat waves in some of the European countries. And, and sadly, close to 1,000 or even more than 1,000 people died as a result of the wildfires caused by heat waves in Europe. So I really think, the timing of this webinar is perhaps in a way appropriate, in the sense that, even some of those people who have doubted or denied, the issue of global warming are seeing it before their very own eyes and seeing the reality of the impact of global warming. Statistics don't lie. I was just looking at the statistic here on the flyer of this event, that by 2050, about 216 million people in the world will be affected by displacements related to climate change. And perhaps I can, just maybe mention a few countries on the continent, because we're looking at here displacements as a result of climate change in Africa. On the continent, I can mention quite a few countries such as Zimbabwe, where after Cyclone Idai, so many people were displaced. As we speak now, and I'm happy that Dr. Ebba is here, and thank you so much, Dr. Ebba, for initiating the UNHCR partnership with with the Center for Human Rights. And I really want to thank you for that, because already that partnership is bearing a lot of fruit. We've already held a joint event with UNHCR at the Regional Bureau for Southern Africa. And I must also then here at this juncture perhaps thank the colleagues in the UNHCR Regional Bureau for Southern Africa, in particular Ursula Guy and colleagues. And thank you so much, Isabel, as well for joining this meeting. And we are looking forward to your presentation as well. But as I was saying, we are, we have seen the impacts of climate-induced displacements in Zimbabwe, but not just Zimbabwe. We also noticed displacements in Mozambique and Malawi. As we speak, even people who were displaced in Zimbabwe 3 years ago are still homeless. They were displaced. And it's really a sad situation. When you go to Angola, many people have been displaced as a result of prolonged drought in Angola, and some of the people are moving now to Namibia, have moved to Namibia. And this is just so disconcerting, because now most of those people will have moved and crossed the borders to Namibia, find themselves in no man's land. And I think perhaps it could be because, some of the conventions, and this is why I'm looking forward to the presentations by our colleagues from University of Johannesburg, who are going to make presentations on whether or not, the legal framework on the continent at the regional level adequately covers people who have been affected by climate change and who have been displaced by climate change. Are they adequately protected? Are they adequately covered? So really looking forward to the presentation by Dr. Cristiano Dossi and also Dr. Harissa Fawole. And really also at this stage, perhaps to say thank you to our friends in academia from the University of Johannesburg and from the University of Stellenbosch with, I think, Dr. Kafuro also giving us a presentation. And I think this brings me also to the role of the IOM, and I really want to appreciate Arnold for being here with us, and we really appreciate the partnership, because I think the role of IOM is going to be quite critical in assisting and protecting persons who have been displaced by climate change, and perhaps they have no one to help, to help them. I mean, I think even the International Red Cross Society was inundated by cries for assistance, especially because of destruction of homes as a result of climate change. The Red Cross had to sort of chip in and provide shelter, temporary shelter, for so many people who were displaced as a result of the cyclones and some of the wildfires that we've noted. And I mean, Madagascar was also not spared. So we need to spare a thought for, people living in some of the small island nations, such as Madagascar, where again, we have witnessed severe weather impacts. And one, it's interesting, and I mean, in fact, it's quite sad when you look at even countries like South Africa, perhaps, who one would think have got the capacity to mitigate, the impacts of climate change. But sadly enough, even the South African government really faced a hard time when people in KwaZulu-Natal were displaced by the floods, and we saw, over 400 people dying in South Africa because of the floods, and they lost shelter and they were displaced. Many people were displaced. So I think this webinar, the way I am looking at it is that the presentations and the discussions and the deliberations will perhaps help us to come up with some solutions. What do we do in the face of climate change-induced displacements. What is the role of the government? What is the role of civil society? What is the role of UNHCR and IOM? What is the role of academia in really coming up with solutions to protect and even to prevent, some of these, unfortunate displacements which are caused by the climate crisis. So once again, I just want to thank everyone who planned this event. I mean, a special thank you really to Abby for coming up with this idea. And I think it's so important for us that we discuss this issue. And I'm looking forward to Dr. Ebba's keynote speech, which will, I think, set the context for the deliberations. So I do not want to take too much time, because I see Abby is looking at me and saying, no, look, I think you need to stop now. Your 5 minutes are over. So let me leave time and give the opportunity and the floor through the moderator, Mr. Ashnafi, to the rich panel, made up of very eminent speakers and experts who are going to really give us the meat of the discussion. So thank you very much, Abby, for giving me the floor, and I will hand over to you. I wish everyone successful deliberations, and I hope that the many participants who we have joined, I understand that we have over 50 participants, or maybe over 60 participants who we have joined this particular webinar. I hope that you are going to enjoy the webinar and that you are going to contribute so that we, on the African continent, we can really craft some durable solutions for this phenomenon of climate change-induced displacements. Thank you so much. Over to you, Mr. Ashnafi.
Thank you very much, Mr. Koveya, for this very warm welcoming remark. Now we're very delighted to have Dr. Patrick Ebba from Unhcr, and he will be giving us a keynote speech. To just briefly introduce Dr. Ebba, he is the Deputy Director of the Division of International Protection at the Unhcr, and he is also responsible for the legal and policy work of the organization in respect to refugees and stateless persons. Previously, he had worked as expert on health law and policy with academic and parliamentary institutions in South Africa, Malawi, Senegal, and with UN entities. He later joined UNAIDS, where, among other responsibilities, he led the organization's global legal and human rights work with the judiciary and parliamentary institutions. He had also served for 10 years as an expert member of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, and from 2018 to 2021, he was the UNAIDS country director in the Central African Republic. Dr. Ebba holds a PhD in law from the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, an LLM in human rights and democratization in Africa from the University of Pretoria, and another master's degree in international humanitarian action from the University of Aix-en-Provence in France and the University of Deusto in Spain. He was the winner of the 2016 Vera Shirwa Award, and he was awarded the Order of Merit as a Commander of the Central African Republic. He's also the author of numerous publications, and we are very delighted to have you, Dr. Ebba. The floor is yours now.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Abby, for this generous introduction. Dear colleagues and friends, the reality of climate change and its impact are upon us. We've just heard Lloyd speak to some of those challenges across the world. In April this year, intense rains hit the eastern coast of South Africa, causing catastrophic floods and landslides in KwaZulu-Natal and the Eastern Cape province. More than 440 people died. 12,000 houses were destroyed, and an estimated 40,000 people were forced out of their home in what is considered as one of South Africa's deadliest disasters in this century. For somebody like me, who has lived in South Africa and graduated from UKDZN, this disaster hit home. Yet, the triple planetary crisis of climate change, pollution, and biodiversity loss continue to expand. Such extreme events are only likely to become more recurring, pushing thousands, even millions of people to move within and across borders in search of safety and dignity on our continent of Africa, but also globally. From Madagascar to Burkina Faso, to Somalia, to Chad, to Mozambique, climate change is exacerbating pressures on Arab lands and natural resources. Climate change is heightening competition for limited resources and amplifying social tensions. In many parts of Africa, climate change and natural disaster are risk multipliers that are driving conflict, displacement, and protection needs. According to the World Bank, climate change could lead to the displacement of more than 200 million people by 2050. Colleagues and friends, this is why the adoption yesterday by the General Assembly of the United Nations of Resolution 76-300 is so significant. This resolution is an unequivocal recognition of clean, healthy, sustainable environment as a human right that creates obligations for states. Yet, as they move for safety, 70% of IDPs fleeing conflict and violence and 40% of refugees currently live and are hosted in highly climate vulnerable countries, most notably in Africa. Vulnerabilities are being amplified where people are already facing poverty, limited access to basic services and resources, conflict or violence, and where they are relying on climate-dependent livelihoods. Vulnerable communities are being hit the hardest, and among them, refugees, internally displaced, and their host communities. Unhcr, my organization, recognizes the multifaceted challenges of climate change and disaster, and why those issues are so relevant to our mandate. To respond to them, Unhcr has adopted a strategic framework for climate action, which articulates 3 pillars for engagement and for action. The first pillar relates to law and policy. It seeks to guide the interpretation and application of relevant legal and policy frameworks, to develop guidance and to catalyze international discussion on climate change. The second pillar focuses on ensuring that Unhcr's country operations preserve and rehabilitate the natural environment and mitigate the environmental degradation in displacement settings, as well as enhance the resilience of displaced people and host communities to climate-related and environmental risk. The third pillar of our strategic action framework focuses on improving Unhcr's environmental sustainability by reducing greenhouse gas emission and by minimizing the negative impact of our work on the environment. Of these 3 pillars, myself and my colleagues working on protection at Unhcr are directly responsible for advancing Pillar 1 on law and policy, which is the focus, indeed, of today's webinar. I would like at this point to thank all my colleagues in the Southern Africa Bureau for the work that they are doing in support and engaging with the Center for Human Rights. And I would also like to take this opportunity to thank and welcome the presence of our colleagues from IOM at this event today. Wherever displacement occurs, UNHCR strives, in line with our protection mandate, to ensure that people affected in the context of climate change and related disaster are properly protected when they flee in search of safety, and that the existing global and regional legal frameworks relating to refugees and IDPs are correctly interpreted and consistently applied. In the fulfillment of our supervisory responsibility over the implementation of international refugee instrument, and as the lead agency for the global protection cluster in response to internal displacement, UNHCR is providing important guidance and technical support on the application of existing instruments in both situations. We are doing so in many countries across Africa, including Chad, Sudan, Ethiopia, and elsewhere. UNHCR is also engaged in helping states and other actors design proper laws and policies in the context of climate change. Colleagues and friends, while Africa is the continent most vulnerable to climate and disaster-induced forced movements, it is also arguably the one continent with the most progressive regional legal framework for the protection of those moving within and across borders due to climate change. Yet, the promises of these regional instruments in Africa, notably the 1969 OAU Convention and the Kampala Convention, the promises of these instruments indeed are yet to be realized through the effective implementation, and the effective implementation in particular of the broad and protective provisions. Our panelists today will be discussing these issues in detail, and we'll be shedding light on the normative content, implementation, promises, and challenges of these regional as well as global instruments in the context of climate change. But let's face it, colleagues, the understanding of the applicability of refugee and IDP legal frameworks, as well as human rights norms in the context of climate change and disaster remain extremely limited. This is why research and legal analysis should form a central part of our response to climate change and natural disasters. We need to better understand the actual impact of climate change on population groups and communities at regional, national, and local level. And we need to conduct in-depth analysis of the related protection risk that people face in these situations. To contribute to this research agenda, UNHCR co-organized in 2021, together with the Caldos Center on Refugee Law, the PPD, IOM, IGAD, and the very University of Pretoria and the University of Nairobi and other partners, a workshop series on developing a research and policy agenda for addressing displacement and migration in the context of disaster and climate change in Africa. UNHCR is actively supporting the implementation of this research agenda and the work of the African Researchers Network that was subsequently established. But further research is needed to ensure a full and effective application of the OAU Convention for the protection of people displaced across borders in the context of climate change and disaster on the African continent. This is a priority for UNHCR that will require continued and close partnership with African experts in the coming years. The response to the legal, policy, social, and security issues raised by climate change requires the engagement of diverse stakeholders in addressing the intersectional aspects of this phenomenon. Academics and researchers are critical actors in building these intersectionalities, but we must expand our engagement to other actors of the legal community, including lawyers, members of the judiciary, human rights group, as well as refugees and IDPs themselves, because their voices and their agency are essential in shaping effective responses. While research is central to our work, it must go hand in hand with sustained efforts to advocate effective protection and implementation of the human rights and refugee law norms in the context of climate change by engaging global, regional, and national bodies and actors. Colleagues and friends, efforts are also needed to better monitor and track developments and progress in law and practices on these issues at regional and national level. Allow me to end by expressing my sincere thanks to the Center for Human Rights for holding today's webinar, which will provide much needed space to reflect on the challenges, but most importantly, to strategize together on how we can use the law as a shield for effective protection of all those forced to flee within and beyond borders due to climate change. Thank you very much, colleagues.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ebba, for this very insightful keynote speech. Now we move to the panel discussion. Participants, you can raise your questions in the chat box while the panelists make their presentations. You will have the opportunity to raise your questions and comments later once all panelists have made their presentations. So the next speaker is Ms. Isabel Michel, who is the protection officer at the UNHCR. To briefly introduce you, Isabel Michel is currently working as a protection officer on climate change and disaster displacement in the Division of International Protection of the UNHCR in Geneva since 2020. Following 3 years of policy functions on this topic in the same division, Isabel joined UNHCR in 2007 and has since served in various positions in Africa, including in Chad, in Congo, and in Mali. She has filled policy functions in UNHCR's Regional Bureau for Africa in Geneva during the 3 years. Before joining UNHCR, Isabel worked for several years as a project manager in private consulting companies, specializing in institutional strengthening for governments. Isabel Michel holds a master's degree in international relations, and she speaks French, English, and German. Thank you very much, Isabel, for joining us and for assisting us throughout the preparation of this webinar. Thank you very much. I hand over the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Abby. Thanks a lot. I'm going to try to share my screen. Please do let me know if you can see it, if it works. Okay, good. Thanks a lot. So, dear participants, I'm very pleased to participate in this webinar. Thanks a lot, the Center on Human Rights, for organizing it. It's a burning topic that we are talking about today, and I will not repeat what Patrick just said as a keynote speech, but I can only echo the importance of the issue and the impacts of climate change on every aspect of our lives, but in particular on displacement patterns. I'm trying to move to the second slide. I'm sorry, I have a small technical issue. Are the slides moving on your side? I cannot hear you. Could you please let me know if it's moving?
Abby, I think you are muted. Ms. Isabel would like to know if, yes. Just.
Thank you. Isabel, it's not moving.
Okay, I seem to have a small issue from my side. It's not working. If the organizer can, let me check if it's working now. If the organizer can try to show the slide, but meanwhile I will continue and just give my statements, and if we manage to have the slides, I will continue on that basis. Thanks a lot. Okay, I see it now. Thanks a lot. Thanks for your help. So just setting the set very quickly. And I would just like to make a reference to the latest IPCC report that was issued this year in 2022 that really recalled us with high confidence that the impacts of climate change affect displacement pattern, and we can expect in the future more displacement related to the impacts of climate change and its illustrations on disaster and extreme weather events. Both slow onset and sudden onset disaster are expected to increase, and climate change in this context is playing a role of threat multiplier or risk multiplier, if we say, that exacerbates the potential for tensions, conflict, violence, or other impacts. I said the potential because, of course, there is the exposure criteria, and there are decisions that we can take. There are measures that we can work on. There is cooperation. We can certainly act to prevent these disasters and to address issues that we are seeing emerging. And other panelists will give us illustrations in the Southern Africa region. The impacts of climate change also have the potential to hinder the enjoyment of a wide range of human rights if they are not adequately addressed, and to hinder the potential for displaced person to return. Of course, we're talking about access to asylum here, mostly in our presentation today, and protection measures to address the need of displaced persons. But once people are protected, we need to look at prospects for return and how people can rebuild lives. Dr. Ebba also highlighted how refugees and IDPs are also hosted in climate vulnerable countries. During the displacement, we need to address climate change related issues, but also we need to have this analysis also on long-term solutions, including return. Next slide, please. I will just show you UNHCR strategic framework for climate action. My colleague Patrick talked about it, so I will not enter into it into detail, but just to structure a bit the ideas and the thinking in our discussion today. I want to give you a very visual presentation of the three pillars that were highlighted by Patrick. UNHCR's work on addressing climate-related issues indeed is based on a holistic approach. While we are going to talk today really mainly on the first pillar of the strategic framework, namely law and policy. the UNHCR's work is based on 3 interrelated pillars, including operational engagement, as we see here on the screen, and greening the way we are operating. All these different aspects of UNHCR works are interrelated and interdependent, and all contribute to the ultimate objective of protecting people, preparedness, resilience building, anticipatory action, disaster risk reduction that we see here under the operational engagement, all contribute to preventing displacement from occurring, and in that sense protect people from displacement and prevent us from triggering international obligation under international law. So we are all engaged in all parts of the house towards the protection of people in need. Next slide, please. I will get now into more details into the legal and normative aspects in international protection for people who are displaced. Could you please change slides, please? In fulfillment of its supervisory responsibility over the implementation of the refugee instruments, UNHCR is providing guidance on application of international refugee law in a number of contexts. Of course, as we've seen, climate change offer really new challenges, situations in relation to displacement, and UNHCR has developed and issued in 2020 legal considerations regarding claims for international protection made in the context of the adverse effects of climate change and disasters. This is a long title, just to say that UNHCR is working on providing clarification on circumstances where international refugee and human rights law might apply to respond to protection needs of people who are displaced, and is further working on this. Next slide, please. So what do these legal considerations say? First, they recall and reaffirm that including in the context of climate change and disasters, when people are displaced across border and have protection need, international refugee law might be applicable in specific circumstances. 1951 convention, indeed, as it's regularly highlighted in conferences and discussion, doesn't entail a specific criteria related to climate change, and it was not necessarily a primary concern at the time of the drafting of the convention. However, the scope of the convention is broad enough to allow interpretation in light of contemporary challenges that we see, including in relation to the impacts of climate change. And there might be in this context link with conflict, with violence, for instance, but also other forms of persecution under the convention ground. I think in this context, we might get back to my earlier comment on climate change and its role of vulnerability or risk multiplier. Climate change and related disasters cannot and should not be looked at in isolation as an abstract phenomenon or separate criteria from other elements of a protection environment. their effect indeed act as role as vulnerability multiplier. This means that they add to already existing vulnerabilities, risks, discriminatory practices, fragilities in a society or for specific groups of population. As an illustration, the effects of climate change and disasters on people's freedoms, on livelihoods, on lives are often exacerbated by other factors, such as poor governance, undermining public order, such as the scarcity of natural resources, fragile ecosystems, demographic changes, socio-economic inequalities, xenophobia, political, social, or religious tensions, or other elements. It's vitally important to recognize these implications and to respond to the challenges of climate change and the links with displacement, including in reinforcing efforts by states to prevent and to mitigate the effects of climate change, as well as measures protecting particular population groups from its effects or not. There is always a human dimension and decisions that are linked to how the impacts of climate change or disasters are managed in a society. Therefore, when an asylum decision maker is confronted with asylum seekers from a country affected by the effects of climate change or disasters, the decision maker should not focus narrowly on the climate change event or the sole disaster as solely or primarily a natural phenomenon or hazard, but rather it should look into how it was and is being handled by state entities, what the effects, the response, as well as the hazard itself has on a society or a group of population, on the well-being of the population and the enjoyment of human rights of the people and distinct population and communities, and how each community has different is feeling differently the impacts of the disaster. And this is only in relation to this human action dimension that the elements possibly constitutive of a well-founded fear of persecution for one or more convention ground should be looked at. This is what I wanted to highlight really on the application of the 51 Convention. Of course, the regional instruments such as the WAU Convention and the expanded refugee definition criteria of even seriously disturbing public order might also be relevant. Unhcr organized a side event in the margin of its executive committee in 2018 on climate change and displacement, featuring the participation of the African Union. And the Commissioner Salih Fadel, who was a panelist in this event, pleaded for an evolutionary interpretation of the criteria of even seriously disturbing public order to allow a full and proper application of the WAU Convention for the protection of people displaced in the context of climate change and disasters in Africa. Of course, as my colleague Patrick highlighted in his keynote speech, all these requires research. We need in-depth analysis of situations of people on the ground in relation to climate change related displacement. What is the reality of displacement? What are the challenges that we see emerging? What is the impact on people's, but on society and public order as a whole? How to actually implement those instruments that exist, which indicia do we use, which threshold do we consider as relevant to ensure that people can receive protection? How do we assess that they are not relevant in some specific situations? All this requires a lot of research. UNHCR really considers this as a priority and indeed engages with universities, with researchers in Africa, but in all regions of the world, to have a better understanding of the actual links between the impacts of climate change, displacement, and specific vulnerability or situation and protection risk on specific populations. When refugee law, as you said, is applicable in all these circumstances, but international human rights law might also have a role to play, in particular the non-refoulement principle, when people might face immediate harm, including in relation to the impacts of climate change and disasters. The Human Rights Committee recalled states and everybody that indeed there are obligations under international human rights law, including in the context of climate change, and that people should not be returned to their country of origins where they might face such immediate risk for their lives. When all these instruments might not be applicable for a specific situation, but still people might be in need of protection, temporary protection, humanitarian visa, stay arrangement might offer practical way of protecting people in need. We need to also apply these forms of protection wherever possible and needed. And for this, UNHCR engages a lot in cooperation with states and other partners to provide guidance and guidelines on situations where there might be needed, to where's awareness on specific protection needs of people in specific situations following disaster. States do recognize protection needs and indeed, as a matter of practice, ensure protection to people in need following disaster in specific situations. This was the case, for instance, after the earthquake in Haiti a few years ago, when there was human rights violation following the disaster, and people fled to neighboring countries in the search of safety, including following a famine in Somalia in 2018, and people fled in neighboring countries. We saw that state practices recognized these protection needs and offered forms of protection to people in need. UNHCR is there on the ground together with partners, highlighting the needs of populations, and this is extremely important to ensure proper implementation and actual protection of people, whatever the situations. Of course, we need to pursue efforts, and this leads me to the next slide, please. On the need to cooperate and the need to have an integrated approach in a coordinated manner. Next slide, please. Here, I would just like to recall what I said in my introduction on the three interrelated pillars of UNHCR's climate action. risk mitigation, resilience of communities, adaptation measures, including regular migration as another form of adaptation, are all useful measures that can contribute to preventing forced displacement from occurring in the first place, and they are absolutely essential to be also part of the overall protection environment and options that we can offer to people. If people can remain in their home, this is really the first and primary forms of protection we can offer, and we're all striving towards this objective. And of course, when displacement occurs, legal and normative instruments must fully apply wherever applicable. This requires cooperation. This it requires to work across silos. This requires to share information, to complement our own analysis with the observations that partners see on the ground, to ensure that we have all a full and complete picture of the situation, of the challenges that population face, and that we can all play our role on the basis of our respective mandate and expertise. I'm gonna just refer to specific partners where this coordination and information sharing is effective. UNHCR is a standing invitee to the steering group of the Platform on Disaster Displacement, together with IOM, and is providing really insights on related issues that are being discussed in this frame. UNHCR is also a core member of the Task Force on Displacement of the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage under the United Framework Convention on Climate Change, and this frame is very active in providing guidance on displacement-related issues to the parties of the convention, and will be at COP27 that is actively preparing now together with partners. And UNHCR is also engaged actively in the UN network on migration to promote regular migration as an effective way of preventing forced displacement from occurring in the climate change workstream of the network. I think I will stop there. Thanks a lot for your attention. Over.
Thank you so much, Ms. Isabel Michel, for this very insightful presentation. If you have questions, you can raise your questions later. Now we move on to Dr. Cristiano Dorsey's presentation. To give you a brief introduction of Dr. Dorsey, he is a lecturer and senior research fellow at the South African Research Chair in International Law at the University of Johannesburg. Dr. Dorsey also holds a laurea, which is a BA honors equivalent in international relations from the University of Università degli Studi di Perugia. I'm sorry if I pronounced it wrongly. He also has a master's degree from the Diplomatic Studies of Italian Society for International Organizations in Rome, and a 2-year diploma, which is a Master's of Advanced Studies equivalent in International Relations and International Law from the Graduate Institute for International and Development Studies in Geneva. He also holds a PhD in International Relations and International Law from the same institution. Additionally, Dr. Cristiano has done postdoctoral studies at the University of Michigan Law School as a Grotius Scholar and at the Center for Human Rights, University of Pretoria. His research interests mainly focus on the legal protection of displaced and forcibly displaced persons in Africa, on African human rights law, and more broadly on the development of public international law in Africa. The topic of his presentation is the protection accorded by the OAU Refugee Convention to refugees displaced in the context of climate change and disasters. Dr. Dorsey, thank you very much for joining us. I hand over the floor to you now.
Yes, thank you so much, Abby, for the invitation to this very timely webinar, because climate change is really becoming an issue. I'm Italian, so I'm currently in Italy visiting my family, and I can confirm that also in my hometown here, the temperatures are very high, even for this season. Actually, in Italy at the moment, it's very, the temperatures are higher compared, although it's summer, but the temperatures are really high compared to the average of the season. I'm speaking about the feasibility of the fact that the OIU Convention 1969 OIU Convention can be extended to protect people displaced for climate change and natural disaster. Of course, as everyone knows, among the panels, I don't know, also in the audience, we don't have published the preparatory works of the OIU Convention. So what I'm trying to do in this short presentation is try to summarize a bit the view of the doctrine on this issue. If the OIU Convention can also encompass the displaced person because of natural disasters and climate change. As I mentioned, in international doctrine, there is no univocal or homogeneous position on the status of the people displaced in the context of climate change and natural disaster. I will call them environmental refugees. That is one of the expressions that is normally used, along with several others. But just to make briefly my presentation, I will call these people displaced as environmental refugees. Although I realize that is a debatable definition, in fact, but just for the brevity. In general, victims of environmental disaster find problematic to argue that they, as individuals, have been victims of persecution. This is due to the classically extensive nature of such events. And hence, it's easier to contend that individuals, as members of a broader group of victims of so-called environmental persecution, by virtue of belonging to that group, are themselves also an object of persecution. This is particularly true when an entire group may be intentionally affected because of its particular lifestyle or specific territorial settlement. So, as I said, I will try to do, the doctrinaire discourse on environmental refugees. If, apart from few exceptions, the majority of the doctrine is in favor of denying the protection of environmental refugees under the definition of refugee as stated in the 1951 Refugee Convention, the doctrinaire debate is far more divisive when it comes to the analysis of the definition of refugee provided by the OIU Refugee Convention, the 1969 Refugee Convention. Naldi, Dr. Naldi, Gino Naldi, in 1999, resolutely affirms that environmental refugees constitute a category to be taken into serious consideration when analyzing the refugee problem in Africa. And this was, as I repeated, in 1999. It means 23 years ago, when this debate was still far to be raised. For NALDI, the Refugee Convention, the 1951 Refugee Convention, definition of refugee does not apply to mass exodus, while the OIU Refugee Convention, as we all know, it applies. That is why the OIU, according to NALDI, considered that such a narrow definition failed to take account of the particular difficulties that Africa faces, such as wars of national liberation, environmental catastrophes such as drought. Somalia, for example, is cyclically affected by this phenomenon, and famine, which has resulted in massive flight, displacing entire populations. Therefore, for NALDI, the intention of the drafters of the OIU Refugee Convention, whose officially preparatory works have never been published, was also to include forced displacement for environmental reasons as part of the African refugee definition. Aurélie Lopez in 2007 shares a similar view when she states that the OIU Refugee Convention, although not primarily designed with an environmentally displaced person in mind, unequivocally includes victims of environmental crisis, since such events seriously disturb the public order. Lopez therefore concludes that environmental refugees are included in UNHCR mandate. Similarly, Urela Mira, that is a Tanzanian scholar, back in 1989, it means 33 years ago, indicates that the expression events seriously disturbing public order, the expression in the definition of a refugee in the African Convention, contained in the refugee definition of the OIU Refugee Convention, was intended to cover a multiplicity of man-made situations that prevent people from residing safely in their country of origin. In addition, Urela Mira claims that Article 1.2 of the OIU Refugee Convention provides the necessary flexibility to include victims of ecological calamities such as drought or famine. Tal Schreier, that I supervised in 2008, shared also a similar opinion, affirming that the plain reading of the phrase events seriously disturbing
I think Dr. Cristiano's connection is a bit shaky. Okay, until he comes back, we might need to see one of. Okay.
environmental disasters such as drought or.
Please go on, Dr. Cristiano. You are muted, Dr. Cristiano.
No, I'm sorry. I would like to know if you missed something of what I said because of the connection. Did you hear about Schreier?
Maybe can you repeat the last 30 seconds, please?
Yes, sure, no problem. I was saying after Schreier that in 2008 affirmed that the plain reading of the phrase events seriously disturbing public order were not automatically excluded, that also earthquake and drought could be interpreted as a serious disturbance. I was going back again. I was indicating, you know, how authors in the last 30 years, back and forth, they were all more or less agreeing. Musenda in 1995 agrees that natural disasters such as drought and desertification are among the push factors that force Africans to leave their usual place of residence. Musenda notes, however, that in most of the African cases, it's not the environmental disaster, but rather the political and economic factors surrounding the crisis that turn, for example, a drought to starvation. Muzenda made this very famous example of what happened in Ethiopia during the Mengistu dictatorship in the 70s, when the drought was used by Mengistu as a weapon to starve political opponents. I mean, so and we have several in this case. It's easy to link the natural disaster with the political persecution. In fact, Tamara Wood in 2015 is very analytical in her reasoning. She found that the expression events seriously disturbing public order contained in the refugee definition of the OIU Convention should be construed to include environmental calamities. She bases her conclusion on several arguments. First, and very logically, I would say, the ordinary meaning of the phrase events seriously disturbing public order emphasizes the effect of given events as neutral vis-a-vis their causes. Second, as in the case of Somalis in Kenya in 2011-12, it is uncommon for natural calamities to have uniquely environmental grounds. Often socio-political factors play a significant role in the displacement, as also the example that I made about Mengistu shows. In addition, the OIU Refugee Convention object and purpose of refugee protection mitigate against construing events seriously disturbing public order as excluding environmental occurrences. Finally, the OIU Refugee Convention is the regional complement, as Article 8 of the Convention states, to the 1951 Refugee Convention. This means that it addresses issues specific to the African continent and therefore permits the divergence between environmental refugees under Article 1A2 of the 1951 Refugee Convention and Article 1.2 of the OIU Refugee Convention, admitting that the first convention did not envisage environmental refugees. So this is, if you want, a contrario reasoning, saying that the first instrument was not targeting environmental refugees, as the OIU Convention is the regional complement, so it should fulfill lacunae of the universal instrument. It can be construed, it can be interpreted that the OIU Convention can include what was not included in the 1951 Convention, including, of course, at this point, the protection of environmental refugees. However, in contrast to this inclusive view that we saw until now, several other scholars, they are not really convinced about the introduction of environmental refugees as a category to be protected by the OIU Convention. For example, in 2005, Mandel, who drafted a very interesting and very informative paper as an external consultant for UNHCR, argues that Article 1.2 of the OIU Refugee Convention does not explicitly cover individuals fleeing degrading ecologically conditions. Moreover, there is scant evidence of this refugee definition being applied in such circumstances, and the inclusion of natural disaster does not easily accord with criteria that related to other man-made events such as foreign aggression. Moreover, Alice Edwards, in 2006, Alice Edwards, who recently has been appointed special rapporteur for torture at the UN, has that though it may be possible to argue the OIU Refugee Convention covers environmental calamities, whether linked to human activity or not, this interpretation has not been openly accepted by receiving states. Although Africans displaced by environmental causes are sometimes granted refuge on the territory of the neighboring states, hosting states hardly declared until recently that they are acting in compliance with their OIU Refugee Convention obligations. Hence, in Ellie Sidwell's opinion, while there may be some evidence of African states according to environmental refugee protection under the OIU Refugee Convention, this is not supported by any opinion jurist. I'm almost in the end of my presentation. To try to at least partially solve the dilemma of the inclusion of environmental refugees in both the Refugee Convention and or the OIU Refugee Convention, in their work in 2009, Doherty and Giannini proposed the idea of a new international convention providing protection exclusively to climate change refugees. Doherty and Giannini argued that climate change refugees must meet 6 criteria in order to receive protection. I'm quoting: forced migration. The 6 criteria, of course, are forced migration, temporary or permanent relocation, movement across national borders, disruption consistent with climate change, sudden or gradual environmental disruption, and a more likely than not standard for human contribution to the disruption. More prominently, Doherty and Giannini contend the refugees created by traditional environmental hazard do not merit protection. Instead, the author affirmed that the proposed definition requires a nexus between the environmental disruption and human action that can acknowledge aggregate human contribution to climate change. Ultimately, their decision to limit refugee protection to only climate change refugees is based on the lack of human contribution to traditional environmental hazard. Thank you very much for your attention, and of course, I'm open for any possible question on my short presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cristiano, for this wonderful presentation. We now move to internal displacement, which is one of the most pressing issues in Africa and across the world, actually. And people displaced in the context of climate change and disasters within their own borders are primarily protected. I mean, the obligation rests on states to protect these people, but we will look at the extent of protection accorded to these people under the Kampala Convention, and Dr. Carissa Fawole will be giving us a presentation in this topic. Dr. Carissa Fawole is a lecturer at the South African Institute for Advanced Constitutional, Public, Human Rights and International Law, and the Department of Public Law at the University of Johannesburg. She obtained a BA honors in International Relations and Development Studies in 2006 and a JD in 2009 from the University of Windsor in Canada. She was a visiting lawyer at the Kenyan section of the International Commission of Jurists as a participant in the Young Lawyers International Internship Program in Canada Bar Association. She has obtained an LLM in 2014 and LLD in 2018 from Stellenbosch University, and her LLD thesis is entitled A Critical Analysis of State Responsibility to Internally Displaced Children in Africa. Her research focuses on children's rights, international law, forced migration, and human rights with a particular focus on Africa. She has published, taught, and presented at conferences on these subjects. And we are really glad that you have joined us, Dr. Carissa. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Abby. And thank you to the Center for the invitation. It's my pleasure to join you all today. So I'm going to share my screen, and please, if someone could just indicate that you can see it, and I will take off my video and continue with my presentation. Let me just put it in presentation mode. And there we go. So what I'd like to do today is to provide an overview of the Kampala Convention as Africa's regional response to internal displacement in the context of climate change and disasters. And so before I start, I was reminded by an email that I received yesterday from the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center. They send updates. And in terms of displacement, they give updates. And for example, this is an example of displacement due to disasters in the last 30 days. And I'm focusing on Africa. And so, for example, in Morocco, there was over 8,000 individuals displaced by wildfires. And in Cote d'Ivoire, there is about 2,400 displaced due to inhabitable housing, and that was due to floods. In Chad, just under 5,000 due to destroyed housing during the rainy season. We can see the effects of climate change there. In Ethiopia, over 15,000 affected and internally displaced by drought. In Somalia, over 112,000 individuals internally displaced by drought. And note there is that is a 231% increase from May 2022. So these are just small, this is a small period of time, a short period of time, and we can see the effects, let alone when we look at displacement over a year and number of years. So in my presentation today, I have largely three aims. So we're going to discuss the legal response to disaster and climate-induced displacement. And we're just obviously going to focus in on the Kampala Convention, which is the binding legal framework responding to the protection and assistance of internally displaced persons in Africa. And that, again, for those who aren't aware, it is a unique feature. At the international level, we have the guiding principles, UN guiding principles on internally displacement, and that is a soft law legal instrument in the sense that it's not binding. Whereas at the regional level here in Africa, we have the Kampala Convention. So I'm going to focus in there. And then we're going to look at also the intersection of provisions in the Kampala Convention. So there are definitely specific provisions that mentioned disaster as well as climate change. For example, when you talk about climate change, you can think about Article 5.4 of the Kampala Convention, and it talks about protection and assistance to persons internally displaced due to disasters, including climate change. So the Kampala Convention provides a direct, specific mention of climate change. But we also need to consider other provisions that intersect and are also relevant that maybe do not mention disasters or climate change, but are also applicable in this context. And last of all, we'll just briefly look at implementation and accountability, because overall, the Kampala Convention is a solid convention in terms of it's holistic, and it does address the specific context of disaster and climate-induced displacement. However, the issue, as is with many human rights instruments at the international as well as the regional level, is the implementation and accountability for these provisions. They need to actually be put into action and have an effect, or we also need to critically examine how they are implemented and see what effect that they're having. Is it actually assisting people who are internally displaced? So we'll briefly look at that. So in terms of disaster and broadly, and we can link this also with climate change, in internal displacement, in its definition, it includes it as one of the recognized causes. So internal displacement caused by natural or human-made disasters. And in terms of the Kampala Convention, even in the preamble, and when I teach about international law and conventions, I always direct my students to the preamble. We sometimes want to ignore it, but it tells us what we are trying to, what the document or the instrument's trying to achieve, what has happened, what is influenced it, and where it's going. And so in terms of the Kampala Convention, one prior paragraph, the preamble talks about addressing displacement caused by natural disasters, because it does indeed, the drafters did recognize that it has a devastating effect on human life, peace, stability, security, and development. So it's not just the flood and its effects at that specific time, but it has broader, far-reaching effects. And that is something that's recognized by this particular instrument. So in terms of the definition, I did mention it includes natural and human-made disasters as one of the, what we would say, causes of internal displacement. So as opposed to persons seeking asylum outside their place of habitual residence and have crossed an internationally recognized border, those seeking asylum, those persons who are seeking refugee status, internally displaced persons don't have this same hurdle. Disaster, and we can say climate change induced disasters, are included and understood as part of what can cause them to be in this situation of forced displacement. And then in terms of another portion of the definition of understanding internal displacement, we can look at forced movement, evacuation, and relocation. And we can have those sorts of situations. And I'll just touch on that briefly later when I talk about arbitrary displacement. But in terms of climate-induced displacement and disasters, there could be situations where there is forced evacuation that may not be warranted, and that can qualify as internal displacement. So let's go on. I think in terms of the Kampala Convention, what is interesting and to understand is that it addresses, it addresses climate-induced displacement and disasters at the various phases or stages of displacement. We can look at pre-displacement or prevention, during displacement, and also post-displacement, or when we're looking to achieve durable solutions. So my first set of comments will address those first phases. And I'll just give some examples. For example, in Article 2.4, this really talks about the prevention, addressing in some ways a way of putting in place a mitigation strategy. So if there are early warning systems in place, and if state parties actually comply with this obligation, it may not it can't prevent the disaster from happening, but they can be more prepared and the effects can be mitigated. And so that's one way of addressing displacement. And if steps are taken, it may be less people are displaced. So this is one legal obligation upon states to address disasters and climate change in terms of prevention. And next, there's also, again, in Article 4, we look at the concept of arbitrary displacement. And that has many different forms, but one of the forms included is forced evacuations. It is a cause of natural or forced evacuations due to natural or human-made disasters. So we can see there that it's not, and these are evacuations that aren't warranted. There are indeed cases where it's necessary for saving people's lives and to ensure their safety and protection. But there are other situations where it's not warranted. And so this is, these are examples of provisions that address this pre-displacement phase. In terms of during displacement, it's the article, a good example is the article I mentioned, Article 5.4, and it talks about protection and assistance in terms of natural or human-made disasters, including climate change. And so this is a broad obligation on states, and it really, in terms of implementation, we would have to really break it down and to see what they have to do at domestically to ensure this adequate protection and assistance to the risks that internally displaced persons face. But at least in terms of broad strokes, Article 5.4 provides a general and a specific obligation in this context of disasters and climate change to provide protection and assistance. So it provides legal coverage in that respect. In terms of the post-displacement phase, or when we're looking in some ways for durable solutions, there's one example I'm going to give in terms of compensation. This is in Article 12. And so it's talking about the states must or provide in some form of reparation if they don't protect the property of internally displaced persons in the event of natural disasters. I do note the specific reference to natural disasters as opposed to just broadly general disasters, and that's something I think we could look at and to understand why that was specified and how this can be applied. But in terms of the post-displacement phase, when people are trying to return or to relocate or remain where they are, they do need to move on, but they also should be compensated for damage. And so this is one obligation upon states provided under the Kampala Convention to address that issue. Again, we really have to look at the specific implementation and look for examples where this is indeed the case, and if it's not, make sure that it is included in domestic legislation, and make sure that it is in fact accessible for internally displaced persons. And so now this next part of my comments, I'd like to talk about links with other provisions in the Kampala Convention. So these provisions don't mention disaster or climate change, but they are indeed relevant. And so there's a few examples. For example, Article 3.1H, and it talks, again, it's obligations on states to ensure that non-state actors, for example, multinational corporations, are accountable for whether it's specifically arbitrary displacement or that they contribute to incidences of arbitrary displacement. So then we can see that link here, because if in terms of non-state actors, they may have caused or done things that have contributed to disasters and climate change. And there's an interesting article, I think I link later on when I talk about another group with special needs that you can look at that teases this idea out, I think, in much more detail, because it's something that's a bit more complex, but that is definitely an article to look at, and it is relevant in this context. Another context is our climate change related conflicts. Climate change changes the environment, and it may be, for example, resources become more scarce, and this can lead to conflicts. For example, conflicts between agrarian populations or farmers and herdsmen, because it could be that there's less grazing lands, access to water, things like that. And this conflict could cause generalized violence and lead to internal displacement. And so that's something to be aware of, and that's something that's also covered under the definition of internal displacement. With reference to Article 10 in development projects, I think this is also something that's very interesting. When you look at where states are trying to put measures in place that address climate change and create benefits for their populations, however, it also may lead to displacement. And so Article 10 is relevant in terms of providing a framework for ensuring that this is done in a correct fashion, for consultations, for environmental assessments. And so these are other provisions, examples of other provisions that can be linked to this context, and that should be brought into consideration when states take the the steps to respond to climate-induced and disaster-induced displacement. And so in this next part, we're talking about special groups or groups with specific needs. And I alluded to this group. So one example is pastoralists, who have groups that have a special attachment or dependency on the land. And obviously internal displacement, if they are forced to move due to disasters, floods, droughts, that sort of thing, it has a direct effect on their way of life, from their economic, social, and cultural and spiritual well-being, and this affects their lives. And the Kampala Convention recognizes the specific groups and calls on states again to protect and consider this special group in terms of their response to internal displacement. And another group, especially with my focus on children, we think about children have special needs. I talk about risks, rights, and needs, because there are particular needs that are that children encounter that maybe adults do not. For example, harmful practices they are more vulnerable to, sexual abuse and exploitation, forced labor, involvement in hostilities. This happens in the larger context of internal displacement. And that a lot of times occurs because they are separated from their parents or unaccompanied by any adults. And they don't have those habitual systems of protection to provide that cover and support to ensure that they're not pulled into these risks. And in terms of rights, we have the Kampala Convention that recognizes them as a special group. We can look at Article 9 too, but also we have the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the African Children's Charter. And I argue and advocate for reading all of these documents together, these instruments together, because there are specific rights and needs of children. And that we can look at participation and child participation. It's not just expression. It is actually the right to be heard. And that it includes not only for a child to be able to express his or her position or opinion, but for that expression and participation to be taken into consideration. It may not be that the child receives what she or she is asking for, but it is a factor that should be put into consideration. And that's relevant in the context of internal displacement with respect to consultations. Children need a seat at the table. They are going to be affected. And especially in terms of climate change, we can think about the concept of intergenerational justice. Children are affected by climate change in the present because they're in a rapid development phase, and the changes to the environment can negatively impact them. But also, they will also inherit what we have done, whether we've failed or whether we've been successful or somewhere in between, but they'll inherit this new world. And I think about that, what world are my children going to inherit? And in the context of internal displacement, due to disasters and climate change, their participation is important. And I think I skipped over family reunification. That's a huge issue for children in the context of forced migration, and especially in internal displacement. And so ensuring that children, when, especially in terms of disasters, when it might be a very quick or response in terms of a sudden onset disaster, that children are indeed separated from their families, and making sure that that is a consideration in this context, because they need that protection and support. And even in terms of seeking durable solutions, a child that's separated from his or her family, how can they decide where they want to relocate, or if they want to remain or try to go back if they're separated from their families? So these are just some considerations and some other provisions that we need to think of in terms of the legal response to internal displacement in the African context, and especially in terms of disasters and climate change. And so my last comments here are in terms of implementation and accountability. So I said, again, thinking about the links and these specific groups, but then under the Kampala Convention, we have this mechanism called the Conference of State Parties. So it's essentially the parties to the convention are driving and steering the monitoring and evaluation of this instrument. Yes, there are reports that need to go to the African Commission in terms of in their implementation, but this body is important. And so what we can do is we need to advocate and ensure that disaster-induced and climate change-induced displacement is at the forefront here. And we can think about, I think their first meeting, it was, there was a concept note, and that did include a reference to climate change. Then we think about domestication. We can look at the model legislation for the Kampala Convention and ensure that these provisions are implemented in a way that makes sense within the specific national context. In addition to legislation, there are non-legislative measures that need to be put in place. One thing we can think about is a holistic approach. So it may not be just the ministry of the government that deals with disasters. They could be the coordinating body, and indeed that's important, but there could be other bodies that and ministries that must be taken into consideration, whether it's ministries that address children and youth, education, health, all need to be brought on board in terms, and also in terms of the correct budgeting. So we have to, there's a lot to do in terms of the Kampala Convention, but it does, I think, just to conclude, provide a good basis and a good starting point to holistically respond to instances of climate-induced and disaster-induced displacement in Africa. So thank you so much for your attention, and I'll hand back the floor to Abby.
Thank you very much, Dr. Carissa, for this very insightful presentation. Now we turn to Ms. Ursula Nathalie Zietam, who is a UNHCR Senior Protection Officer at the Regional Bureau for Southern Africa. She she oversees the protection issues related to internal displacement and asylum systems, migration and climate change at the Regional Bureau. She has 14 years of experience, including 8 years with UNHCR in Africa and European countries, where she performed in areas of law, human resources, protection and management. She has served in field operations in some of the major refugee and humanitarian crises. She holds 2 master's degrees in international law and international affairs from the University of Sorbonne in France. Her topic is challenges and perspectives of climate change in Southern Africa region. And this is very, we hope this will be very impactful. Thank you very much, Ms. Ursula, for your time and participation. The floor is yours now.
Thank you, Abby. Thank you to the Center for Human Rights for hosting this very important and interesting webinar. So I will start with my presentation. I hope you see my screen. Abby, can you confirm, please?
We can see your screen.
Thank you. Okay. So I will share with you a quick overview of the challenges and perspective related to climate change in Southern Africa region. First of all, okay. So first of all, UNHCR Regional Bureau for Southern Africa performs in 16 countries in the region to provide protection, assistance, and solution to 7.8 million persons of concern, including 6.8 million of internally displaced persons. Among these 16 countries, 9 have been identified as most vulnerable to climate change, especially Angola, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Madagascar, Mozambique, South Africa, Republic of Congo, Malawi, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. These 9 countries are the largest in terms of population, as they host 97% of forcibly displaced people. We are thus witnessing displacement of population within these countries, but also some trends of cross-border displacement following climate-related disaster. This raises the question of the status of people who are forced to cross a national border for climatic reasons to seek for safety. Are we or not in the case of an event seriously disturbing public order, as stated in the OAU Convention? This is still under discussion, as clearly explained by previous speakers. Southern Africa is particularly vulnerable to climate change, and the region has experienced several episodes of natural disaster due to climate change, especially drought and high temperature in Madagascar, in Mozambique also, heavy rainfall and flood, and tropical cyclone. We know that these natural disasters have common consequences in the affected countries. The first consequence is the forced displacement of population, mainly within the border. The loss of livestock livelihood, destruction of property and social infrastructure, increased poverty, severe food crisis, but also death and injuries. Analysis from the World Weather Attribution shows that climate change increases rainfall associated with tropical cyclones, hitting highly vulnerable communities in Madagascar, in Mozambique, and in Malawi in 2022. Based on the statistics shown in countries affected by climate change, we see the real impact on the forced displacement of population in search of safety, land, shelter, and conditions that promote their resilience. From the data we have collected between 2010 and 2019, we estimated an average of 500,000 displacements per year due to climate change and disaster. The fairly recent appropriation of climate-related issues and the multi-sectoral impact of natural disaster in the region gives us an idea of the many challenges we encounter on the ground. The growth and continuity of displacement associated with the vulnerability of affected population who have lost everything. How to reconstitute their housing, their land, and create favorable conditions for their sustainable return and reintegration in their area of origin. Moreover, the legislative framework at the national level deals little with climate-related issues and struggles to put in place prevention, mitigation, and response systems. There is also a need to harmonize policies in the region. The lack of financial resources, which are essential to create climate-resilient frameworks, to assist the affected population to rebuild the destroyed infrastructure and to reconstitute culture, livelihood, to fight against severe food crisis. How to work in synergy to ensure the protection of communities, to better protect women victims of gender-based violence, children victims of school dropouts, exploitation, child labor, and so on. How is UNHCR responding? We have a strategic framework for climate action, which explains how UNHCR is addressing climate change and disaster displacement. And it falls into 4 areas. Field operation to avert, minimize, and to address internal and cross-border disaster displacement, legal advice, guidance, and normative development at national, regional, and international levels to support enhanced protection of the right of people displaced in the context of disaster and climate change. Policy coherence is very key to ensure that issues of disaster displacement are effectively mainstreamed across other relevant policy arenas. And finally, research and knowledge production to fill gaps that underpin this operational and policy work. In terms of some key actions that have been undertaken in the ground for the drought experienced by Angola, Mozambique, and Madagascar, concrete action have been taken at different levels to meet the needs of affected population, to develop policies, and to fund climate resilience projects. Some regional bodies, such as Indian Ocean Commission, SADC, are also very involved in the initiative undertaken. The African Development Bank finance resilience and greening project in Madagascar. And very recently in June, SADC opened a humanitarian and emergency operations center in Mozambique. Concerning floods in Democratic Republic of Congo and in South Africa, joint missions were conducted with the national authorities to assess the damage and the cost of reconstruction, to assist affected population, to develop integrative projects to support both host communities, refugees, and asylum seekers. Tropical Storm Anna in late January 2022 brought winds, heavy rain damages, and destruction to part of Madagascar, Mozambique, Malawi, and Zimbabwe. Anna was followed by tropical cyclone Batirai hitting the south coast of Madagascar on February. Anna and Batirai were the first storm of the 2021-2022 Southwest Indian Ocean cyclone season. Following these 2 events, 2 more tropical cyclones and another storm also made landfall, leading to further flooding and increasing the number of people affected and casualties. The cluster system has been activated to support national authorities in the response. In Mozambique, a policy and strategy on the management of internal displacement was adopted in August 2021. Discussions have been also initiated with the African Development Bank, which plans to finance some projects related to climate change. With regard to Mozambique, more specifically, UNHCR provided a multi-sector support this year under the 3-cluster approach: protection, shelter, and camp, coordination, and management. More than 700,000 people have been displaced, and over 736,000 internally displaced people in Nampula and Zambezia. Protection, habitat restoration, and mental health and psychosocial support are among the interventions provided to population and community affected by this disaster. From our perspective, we are considering the following recommendation and way forward to protect the human rights of persons displaced in the context of climate change. Number one, ensure that all climate action is people-centered and adopts a human rights-based approach, ensuring the dignity, safety, and right of those displaced in the context of the adverse effects of climate change. Number two, apply existing refugee and human rights instruments where there may be need for international protection when cross-border displacement occurs in the context of climate change and disaster. Increase action and support for measures to avert, minimize, and address displacement, in particular in the most climate vulnerable countries and communities based on their specific needs. Ensure that climate action reaches those living in unstable and hard to reach areas, including displaced persons and their host community. Create sustainable housing, more climate resilient for refugees and communities displaced by climate crisis. Ensure human rights are upheld through meaningful and informed voluntary participation in timely relocation schemes. Scale up adaptation, financing, and support to climate action in countries and host community area where displaced people take refuge or hope to safely return to following their displacement by strengthening preparedness and building resilience to climate impact. Address data gaps through the collection of disaggregated data. Cooperate internationally to ensure the protection of all those displaced in the context of climate change, and build or strengthen strategic partnership with other UN agencies, regional bodies, development actors, universities. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ursula, for this very wonderful presentation. Our next presenter is Dr. Kavuro, Calixte Kavuro. To just briefly introduce him, he is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Public Department of Stellenbosch University. He has a PhD from this university and a master's from the University of Cape Town and undergraduate degree from the University of Western Cape. He is a passionate refugee rights advocate with enormous experience in publishing and teaching. Without further ado, I give the floor to Dr. Kavuro for his presentation. I hope, we are already running out of time. So if you are, if you want to leave, it's perfectly fine because we advertised that we will end the webinar at 1 p.m. Those of you who would like to, continue to attending, thank you very much. I give the floor to Mr. Kavuro, Dr. Kavuro. Thank you. Dr. Kavuro, we can't hear you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would be ready to start sharing my screen, and I wanted to know whether my screen is shared, if you can see it on the other side. Sorry, Abby?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. Today, I'm going to speak on sorry, let me adjust my screen because I have something distracting my screen. So that's to okay. Okay, I'm going to speak to the domestic implication of the domestic application of global and regional norms relating to refugees and the IDPs displaced in the context of climate change and the disaster in South Africa. And as the Abby has indicated, I needed to be short because the time is running out. So I'm going to start speaking with looking at the national framework and look at the definition of the term refugee and look at individualistic approach to asylum. And I will go to see the narrow and the wide definition of the term refugee, and I will go to alternative and to individualistic approach, and then we come to the conclusion. So I will be as fast as I can and try to give you all information which I have prepared for you. So in terms of the national framework, the Refugees Act of 1998, as amended, was codified or adopted to give effect to the 1951 Convention and the 1967 Protocol relating to the status of refugees. That is the UN Refugee Convention. And the 1969 Convention governing the specific aspects of refugee problems in Africa. That is the AU Refugee Convention. And it refers to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and any domestic or other relevant convention or international agreement to which the Republic is or becomes a party. So in that context, the rest of other conventions or other agreements, we have in particular the African Union Convention for the Protection and Assistance of internally displaced persons in Africa, which is a Kampala Convention. My colleagues have been speaking about this convention, which is a center for the focus of discussion. But it should be borne in mind that South Africa has not become a party to Kampala Convention. It has neither signed nor ratified this convention. However, in the case of Makwanyane, the Constitutional Court has indicated that whether a convention is binding or not binding, or whether it's ratified or not ratified, given the history of South Africa in terms of human rights abuse, the Constitutional Court has come to the conclusion that the rules of international law include those arising out of binding and not binding treaties, and that all these rules may be used as interpretation. So we may use the Kampala Convention to interpret the Refugees Act, which I'm going to do. So in terms of the refugees, we have a definition, and we have three definitions. And the first definition is drawn from the UN Refugee Convention, and it states that an individual can be recognized as a refugee owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted by reason for his or her race, gender or tribe, religion, nationality, or political opinion, or membership of a particular social group. So that person must be outside of the country or for his or her nationality, and is unable or unwilling to avail himself or herself of the protection of that country, or not having a nationality and being outside of the country for his or her former habitual residence, is unable or owing to such fear and willing to return to it. So that one is drawing from the UN Refugee Convention, which is the 1951 convention. And the second, which is drawn from the African Refugee Convention, states that an individual owing to external aggression, occupation, foreign dominion, or other events seriously disturbing public order in either a party or the war for his or her country of origin or nationality is compelled to leave his or her place of habitual residence in order to seek asylum in another place outside his or her country of origin or nationality. So this captures the issue of the discussion of climate change. And the third definition says that the individual who is a spouse or a dependent of an individual recognized refugee also can be granted the asylum. On these issues of defining the term refugee, South Africa tends to apply definition A, and rarely applies the definition B. For example, despite events seriously disturbing public order in Zimbabwe, for example, Zimbabweans were hardly recognized as refugees. The same applies to people running away from a catastrophic flood or drought. So South Africa has given a focus on that definition, and as a result, it has been argued that 90% of asylum seekers are economic migrants. So the next is looking at or exploring this individual approach. So in that context, the South African, when it takes into account the definition A, which I have discussed, then it takes an individualistic approach to asylum. So this implies that every individual must undergo the process of interview in order to establish a well-founded fear of persecution. So a well-founded fear of persecution is a key to recognition as a genuine refugee. Asylum seekers are therefore admitted into the country for the purpose of processing the asylum application, and it may be refused asylum if the application is found to be fraudulent, abusive, or unfounded, or if they are disqualified from refugee status because of listed ground. For this reason, they do not yet qualify as refugees and are not bearers of the same rights as legally recognized refugees. This approach clearly places the asylum seekers in a vulnerable position. So because South Africa relies on the definition A to recognize refugees, those who are forced to flee owing to climate change, they will not qualify as refugees in South Africa. Why is that the case? Because we have I have tried to respond to that question. Why, looking at a narrow and wide definition. So the UN Refugee Convention provides a narrow definition, and that narrow definition talks about political refugees, whereas the AU Refugee Convention takes into context of humanitarian refugees. So from the humanitarian lens, Redison Kapindu, in his doctoral thesis, defines the term refugees to refer to those individuals who are compelled to flee their country of origin due to various factors that threaten to seriously harm their lives, but which are neither directly or indirectly attributable to wrongful state conduct. Because the first one of UN refugee, we look at the state conduct and we don't look at the other events. So I argue that in order to implement The second definition, South Africa should have 2 categories of refugees. It should recognize political refugees, and then it should recognize humanitarian refugees. So in that context, it should clearly indicate that this certain group of refugees falls within the UN Refugee Convention, whereas a second category of refugees fall within AU Refugee Convention. And that should be clear when it grants refugee status to refugees. So of great concern is that South Africa only applies the definition A and recognizes refugees as dependents in terms of definition A, and rarely applies definition B, which I refer as humanitarian refugees or humanitarian approach. However, the Refugees Act provides alternative, and that alternative is not feasible, is not more practical, because it states that an influx of asylum seekers can be recognized as refugees in terms of Section 55 of the Refugees Act, and it can be recognized by Minister of Home Affairs through government gazette. So it's only the minister who can declare a group of people entering South Africa, so they must come as a group, like if they are sent out by flood or drought, and then the minister will recognize them as refugees. And therefore, we will need to consult the Unhcr and the premier concerned in order to establish area of reception and the area of accommodation for that group. And they also must appoint a person who is going to deal with that problem. So the massive influx of asylum seekers may exclude a person who can flee from perhaps Zimbabwe or perhaps Mozambique or any other place coming alone and to seek asylum in South Africa. In that case, when you come alone, you will be viewed as an economic migrant and will not be viewed as a person fleeing from climate change. So to conclude, the Refugees Act does not extend asylum to refugees of climate change or humanitarian, whom I termed humanitarian refugees. And therefore, there's a need to distinguish between refugees, and therefore they make a distinction, and they state that this particular can be granted refugee status on the basis of the UN Refugee Convention or the 1951 Refugee Convention, and the other that can be also recognized as refugees in terms of the African Union Refugee Convention. And that is on a humanitarian basis, taking into account climate change, taking into account other events that may be disrupting public order or those. So as I mentioned, is that because the second reg of definition is not given, is not put in practice. That's why South Africa tends to say that there's a large number of economic migrants in South Africa who does not fall within the definition of the refugee. And when they do that, they are referring to the first leg of the definition as I have provided it above. Yeah, I think let's me end here because I think I have covered what I wanted to say and be able to keep it to the time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kavoro, for this very interesting presentation. I now quickly give the floor to Mr. Arnold, who is the Regional Disaster Risk Reduction and Climate Change Specialist at the IOM Regional Office for Southern Africa. He has a number of years of experience in CSOs and government. I hope that you'll enjoy his presentation on the topic of the protection of migrants and new initiatives at the global level. I hope you'll finish in 5 minutes. So please wait until he finishes his presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, colleagues. I'll be very brief, being the last. I don't want to stand in between lunch and the ending of this webinar. So I wouldn't even put up my slides. I'll just speak to them very quickly. So one of the things I wanted to highlight was on the emerging initiatives to address climate-induced disaster displacements. And I'm grateful for the insights and lots of useful information from my fellow panelists from academia and Unhcr. So for us, just like most of the presenters, we have our own institutional climate change strategy, a 10-year strategy. I wouldn't mention that as well. But for this discussion, I just needed to share briefly on emerging initiatives or trends and opportunities in the area of climate-induced disaster displacements within the region and at global level. If I look at the one is just to highlight, we have Africa Climate Mobility Initiative. I don't know if colleagues have heard of it or participants have heard of it. So the Africa Climate Mobility Initiative was launched actually last year, which is a partnership between the AU Commission, the UN, World Bank, IOM, and of course, most of academia, policy making, and communities were involved to basically generate momentum and have a common policy agenda and resources for harnessing and addressing the challenge of climate-induced mobility in African continent. So at continent level or at African level, we have this initiative, which pretty much seeks to advance data-based comprehensive solutions to support people-centered adaptation to climate mobility, to protect those on the move, and further resilience of African communities confronting climate crisis, of course, with a focus on challenges and opportunities for climate mobility at both levels. So this is an initiative that I thought, other than the various protocols that have been shared and legal frameworks, that there are already programs, real programs that we need to engage with and see how they benefit the larger climate migration agenda, basically. Then, since majority of organizations are also responding to the crises of displacements at global level during the last year's COP26, there was an initiative on climate and environmental charter for humanitarian organizations, because climate crisis is impacting humanitarian action around the world, and there is need to urgently increase that collective effort, and it is intended to help humanitarian organizations play their part in responding to climate and environmental crises, other than just giving direct support to victims who have been displaced by various disasters, but just to give them or to look at it from an environmental perspective. So it's a charter that most organizations are signed up to, and it would be encouraging if we have among us ourselves individuals who are working in this area. It's a good guide. Then we have addressing disaster displacement in disaster risk reduction policy and practice guidelines, also 2019 document. And this one offers practical guidance to governments to integrate disaster displacement and other related forms of human mobility into their regional, national, and subnational strategies in line with the Sendai framework. At SADC level, at Southern Africa level, IOM, together with other partners, including SADC, developed a regional framework for action to address disaster displacement. This was also a 2019-2020 initiative. So, and then, of course, I'm sure we are all familiar with the SADC migration policy framework, the new framework they have a component on disaster displacement. So this was just to highlight that there are initiatives or there are opportunities. We know COP27 is coming up, and issues around loss and damage, disaster displacement, and integrating human mobility in national retirement contribution and other frameworks is a priority. And we would like to see at national level, if at all we're engaging with these processes, if we're engaging with these initiatives, and see what would be the value add. I see a lot of colleagues from the academia. There's still a lot of issues around, do people really move because of drought, or is it because of other things? So that direct linkage and stuff. So even to improve these initiatives and to inform these initiatives that are available within the region or globally, there's need for us to engage and support in terms of generating that new information and new evidence. Because of time, I'll leave it here, but I just wanted to share that there exist a number of projects or programs that we could tap in to address this issue of climate-induced displacement in the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Arnold, for this very insightful presentation. The panel presentations are finished now. So I will just give Dr. Patrick Ebba to give us a concluding remark. Before that, I would like to thank every panelist and all the attendees, participants of this webinar. Thank you very much for your questions and attendance. I would also like to thank all the people that were involved in the preparation of this webinar, including Isabel, Ursula, and everyone. And lastly, I would like to thank Tiruna, who is hosting this Zoom meeting, and all the comms team who have helped us. Without further ado, I will give the floor to Dr. Patrick Ebba to give us a concluding remark. The questions raised are already answered by the panelists while they're making the presentations. But if you have any questions, you can email us and we'll provide answers. Thank you very much. Dr. Patrick Ebba, okay. All right, I think we can conclude this webinar here. Thank you very much to all of you. We will see you in other conversations on migration issues. Until then, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abby. Thank you.